Hi everyone. In this video, I'm going to try to explain a complicated set of ideas that are really important for trying to come to understand Leibniz. Um, and really, the first thing that we need to distinguish is between concepts and names. So Aristotle was maybe the first to sort of put this distinction in a proper way because he said something to the effect of, philosophy can only go so far, that philosophy doesn't deal with particular objects or things. Like, we don't do like a philosophy of this pen in particular. Maybe that you'll engage in a philosophical reflection on what it means to be an artifact or something like that. But you're always concerned with not individual objects, but at least a class of objects. And that this is what makes something a concept, is that it's like a rule and it picks out a certain group. So if you say pen, it'll pick out this pen as well as, the completed set of all of the pens in the universe. That's what the concept does. Whereas when we think about individuals, like myself, we attach names to those individuals, and that's how we pick out an individual thing. That's why we all have names, is because we're all individuals or particulars, and so that's how we come to know each other. And for Aristotle, concepts and names are fundamentally different because concepts give a rule for inclusion. A pen is, a writing instrument created by human beings that uses ink, or, like whatever. You can have a better definition of a pen, but that's a good starting place. And so, whereas when we talk about names, well, we're not primarily interested in like listing out, like I'm not Penelope in virtue of having a bunch of characteristics that belong to Penelope. At least that's what Aristotle thought. I'm Penelope because that's my name. Um, and so you can't give a rule for including particulars in this way. We just, there's so many aspects of me and they change all the time that if you had a rule, then the rule wouldn't probably really work for particulars. And that's why rules are for sort of like general categories or groupings of objects, whereas names are for particular objects primarily, and that's why we have proper names. Um, and so this is sort of the traditional way that people talk about concepts, is that concepts are meant to pick out a general class of objects. Now, what Leibniz is going to do that is going to make Leibniz very confusing initially, but I think that we can nonetheless sort of like follow his path, is that he's going to reject this very common sense distinction between names and concepts. And part of his motivation for doing this is to think a lot about a God's eye point of view. So he wants to think about, like Spinoza, he wants to say that a focus on names and our naming processes, and he'll refer to these as nominal definitions. That just means that they're definitions by name only. That these are sort of like handy things that we utilize as human beings because we don't have the sort of knowledge that God has. So in other words, our propensity to use nominal definitions or mere names comes from the fact that we have a limited domain of knowledge and that we're finite, basically. But these are not rational reasons to use these. These are, practical reasons to use nominal definitions and names. But if you knew that like everything that God knew about like Penelope, for example, then God would know all of those features that make me me, even the ones that change over time. God would have an absolute knowledge of like when that would happen and under what circumstances, and he would be able to delineate all of the predicates, all of the features of myself, from the moment I was born until the moment that I died. And so Leibniz's thinking about concepts really moves in this direction of, okay, well, in as much as we're doing philosophy and we're interested in a rational investigation of the world, let's not just stop at merely nominal definitions of things. As much as possible, let's try to imagine things the way that they actually are. In other words, the way that God would see and come to understand them, and as much as possible, try to transcend the merely finite point of view that we have, and try as much as possible to get into that sort of like God's eye point of view. And so that's kind of hard, but this is really the central idea behind Leibniz's concept of the monad. So this is Leibniz's most popular and important philosophical concept. And basically, Leibniz is well known for saying that the universe is composed of monads. Hi everyone, just a quick little editing correction / clarification here. In the remainder of this lecture, I'm going to refer to monads, and if you've already done the reading, you might be a little confused because Leibniz doesn't really yet use that terminology in the discourse on metaphysics. But really, he's already come up with the concept of the monad. He just calls it an individual substance or a singular substance. And you can see this especially in his description of singular substances in the 9th sort of point in the readings for this week. That's on page 256. So monads, we're just going to use that because Leibniz's conception of what a substance is so unique, and it all has these special properties that he'll later call monads. I'm just going to refer to them for the remainder of the class as monads. But in case you're confused in the readings, monads just refer to what singular substances are. So individual things, what are those? Leibniz thinks there's an infinite number of them and that they all express the universe in different ways. So the remainder of this lecture is going to try to tease out more about what that idea is and what it involves. But if you want to look, at the readings, I would especially look at section 9 and beyond. So I hope that's helpful for y'all. The entirety of the universe at a single point. And so Leibniz's point of view is that there are an infinite number of these and that they all harmonize with one another. They all sort of go together. They all reflect or express the same thing, which is the world as God created it. Now, it's a very complicated idea. It's very hard to imagine why anyone would say, instead of the world being composed of stuff like pens or whatever, that it's really monads. But it's a very complicated idea, and the more that you think about it, actually, the more sense that it makes. And so this is really a rough attempt to explain this idea, and we're going to explain it through the idea of Julius Caesar. So, again, here, importantly, we're treating Julius Caesar as a concept. We're not treating it like how we would ordinarily treat a name. How we normally treat a name is just kind of like through pointing. We would be like, Julius Caesar, it's that person that is referenced by my history textbook or Wikipedia or that play by Shakespeare or whatever. And so that's how we would normally understand Julius Caesar. But Leibniz isn't interested in that. Leibniz is interested in how would God understand Julius Caesar, and how would he understand him as a concept? In other words, like, how would God be able to pick out all of the features of Julius Caesar as an individual and know them in a complete and robust way? And it turns out that in order for God to have an adequate knowledge of Julius Caesar, that he would have to have adequate knowledge of all of the facts about everything in the universe. And so that is sort of the sense that every monad contains the whole universe. You can think about Julius Caesar as one of these monads. And so we're going to see how does Julius Caesar contain the entire universe from God's point of view. Okay, and so this is what I've tried to use my whiteboard space for today. So this is Julius Caesar. I tried to draw him with the funny haircut and all that. Moderately successful. And anyway, what we can see here is just a list of some features about Julius Caesar. So like, number one, Julius Caesar was a human being, right? It seems like an essential property of being Julius Caesar. But then you can infer from the fact that Julius Caesar was a human being, well, human beings are born, right? And so we can know by virtue of the fact that Julius Caesar was a human being that he was also born. And then, moreover, we can move to like events that happen in Julius Caesar's life. So like one thing that Leibniz references is that Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon. And so then you can infer from that the Rubicon is crossable. And then you can start to include all of the facts about the Rubicon, because those are necessary facts that kind of go with the facts that God knows about Julius Caesar. And so later, you can say, all right, and he was killed by Brutus, and this implies that Brutus exists as well, and so on and so forth. And so the point is that if you start to know in the way that God would know Julius Caesar, that is, you know all of the relevant facts about Julius Caesar, then you can see how this would also require you to know all of the relevant facts about everything in the universe, because the fact that like Julius Caesar is a human being implies that you know all of the facts about what it means to be a human being. And similarly, the fact that he crosses the Rubicon, well, that happens because of certain events in his life history, and you would have to know all of those, and you would have to know all of the people that were involved, and so you would have to subsequently know their life history, and you'd have to know sociological facts about how human beings relate. You'd need to know psychological facts about what is involved in the crossing of the Rubicons. And so I know that this is a lot, but I'm just trying to really express the way that if you had a perfect knowledge about any one of these facts, even about Julius Caesar, that in some way it also requires knowledge of all these facts that are apparently unrelated to Julius Caesar, at least unrelated to that particular event. And so what you can see from this is Leibniz has this idea that monads express the entire universe, but that they express the universe from a certain point of view, right? And so what that means is that certain facts about the universe are going to be more immediately relevant or clear to the monad in question, whereas other facts about the universe are going to be obscure. They're going to be not immediately related to the monad, and so they are like more difficult to comprehend. So like, for example, it is clear for Julius Caesar that it's necessary to cross the Rubicon. Without that event in Julius Caesar's life history, then you're not capturing everything that it means to be Julius Caesar. And so it's like one like pretty obvious relationship between Julius Caesar and this event. However, something more obscure would be like the importance of like, you know, some of the soldiers that were involved in the event. They probably played some causally important role in Julius Caesar's war campaigns, so on and so forth. And so those would be facts that are slightly more obscure. And then you could potentially get into even more obscure facts that are also causally relevant to the situation at hand, but aren't obvious to us because we have a very finite point of view. And so like another one of these things would be like facts about gravity, right? Those are obviously important conditions for how all of the military battles go and Julius Caesar's ability to cross the Rubicon, for example, but it's less obvious how those facts bear directly on the life history of Julius Caesar than some of these other events. And so while each monad contains the entire universe, because all of the universe in some ways sort of like acts on that monad or that substance, each monad only has a limited zone of clarity, a limited zone where they can understand like their specific sort of like point of view or position on the universe. They can come to understand a finite number of these predicates that are contained in the subject Julius Caesar. But ultimately, all of them are contained. It's just that the vast, vast majority, an infinite number of these facts are completely obscure to the monad in question. And so I hope that this is helpful. What I basically wanted to show is that Leibniz is trying to think about the nature or structure of the universe from God's perspective, and that implies treating everything as a subject that contains a certain number of predicates, or in this case, Julius Caesar's like a substance that has a certain number of properties, right? And if you want to be as rigorous as God would be, then you ultimately need to contain all of the facts about the universe to even understand one particular substance or monad. But that only a limited number of the predicates show up to us as relevant because we have a finite perspective or point of view. So for Leibniz, it's like the whole universe acts on the monad simultaneously, but the monad is only able to comprehend a certain amount of that universe. The entire universe is like folded in, right, to Julius Caesar. But it can be very difficult to understand, and frankly beyond our finite capabilities, to understand how all of these incredibly minute facts about the universe can ultimately build up into the clear and obvious facts that we happen to know about Julius Caesar. So that's still very difficult and very hard. Again, Leibniz, I believe, is the hardest philosopher that we're going to be examining. But I think that it's pretty fascinating, this theory. And you can kind of see why the person that invented calculus, so the calculation of like relations and the infinitely small parts, right? He's trying to think about that very same thing here. He's trying to think about how these infinitely small or infinitely remote facts about the universe still play some very small, minute, very difficult to comprehend causal role in events that we do know and that we do understand. And so I just think that that's really fascinating. And his sort of picture about monads becomes very influential for the development of computer science, for the development of linguistics. Um, it's very, very, very influential sort of thought that um, to have a complete knowledge of one thing requires a complete knowledge of all of the facts in the universe. And if you really understand that idea, then you have to develop a boundlessly more complex image of the universe than we typically have, where we think that just like kind of like one finite thing, causally operates on another finite thing. For Leibniz, it's like the universe is in concert with itself always and simultaneously and in each individual instance, and in a complex enough way that it never becomes mush, right? Like, it's not like all of the monads are the same. God still knows that Julius Caesar is distinct from Penelope, and he can actually list the exact ways that Julius Caesar is distinct from Penelope or from yourself or any other monad, right? And so you have this picture where there's an infinite number of monads, and they all contain all of the facts about the universe, but nonetheless, God knows them in a completely individual way, where God knows every monad in virtue of the facts about that monad and can rigorously distinguish it from every other monad. So that's very complex and hard to understand, but it's also, I think, a very trippy and interesting just picture of the world. So I hope that was helpful. See you all next week.